that's given here. One question that people often ask is, how comes we didn't know about 1989 and the fall of communism? How comes we didn't have any warning? And the simple response to that is that we did have warning, but it was a very small voice in Adventism. In 1957, a pastor named Lewis Weir, who was an Australian, in 1957, his name was Lewis Weir, he wrote a book, a little tract really, which was called Preparing for the Close of Probation. He wrote a number of books actually, but the title of this one was Preparing for the Close of Probation. And in this tract, from his study of Daniel 11, he came to the conclusion that the Vatican would unite with the Protestants in order to destroy or deal with the Soviet regime of communism. And that prediction was in 1957, which is about 32 years before the event actually occurred. Verse 41. Sorry? Lewis Weir. Lewis Weir. W-E-R-E. Verse 41, he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. We're probably going to spend the longest amount of time on this verse because it's the most controversial, and there's quite a bit of information to get to grips with in this verse. Before I do that, if you go back into history and you see how communism fell, we know that there was a secret alliance between the USA and the papacy in the Reagan years. Okay, that's a matter of history. You can go back and see that and see its fulfillment in this prophecy. One of the arguments that people have with verse 41, and let me give you the overview of verse 41. It says that he, the papacy, shall enter the glorious land, the USA, and many countries is italicized, it's actually incorrect to be there, and many, let me put this thought, then many will be overthrown. Many then will be overthrown, but these will escape Edom, Moab and Ammon. The papacy enters the glorious land, the papacy enters the United States. When that happens, then many will be overthrown, but these escape Edom, Moab and Ammon. That's how I understand this verse to be. One of the arguments that people have is that in this verse, the USA is represented by the glorious land. Yes? But in the verse before, the United States was identified as horsemen, ships, and chariots, chariots, horsemen and ships. So people argue, well, how can one power be identified by two different symbols? Okay, I don't know if you've ever come across that argument. It's not really a strong argument to use. The reason is, different realities or different truths are given different symbols depending on the point that you're trying to make. Okay? So Jesus is known as a lamb, but he's also known as a lion. Yeah? So that's a really simple one to deal with. Depending upon the role of Jesus, if he's going to be sacrificed, he's a lamb. When he's going to come and take revenge upon his enemies, he's a lion. Okay? So that concept shouldn't be alien to us, and it happens in a number of different places. Okay? Another simple one is the papacy. The papacy is identified as who? King of the North, the little horn, the woman, Babylon. So another one? A serpent. The papacy is actually a serpent. I don't think the dragon is the papacy. That's pagan Rome. We'll stop with there. But you get the point. Okay? In verse 40, the United States is identified as chariots, horsemen and ships because of the work that the United States is doing. It's using military and economic strength to bear or to support the papacy and to bring down the USA. Okay? In this verse, the role of America or the United States is different. The role here is that it's a glorious land. So let's deal with this. The first thing that we want to address is that what the glorious land is not. Let's see what it's not. If you go to verse 45, it says there, and he shall plant the tabernacle of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end and none shall help him. So it identifies a term there, glorious holy mountain. So the first thing that I want to say is that the glorious land is not the glorious holy mountain. If you look at the words behind the Hebrew words behind those verses, you have basically two words. You have glorious land, so you have two words, then you have glorious holy mountain, and I'm going to connect these two together and call that two. If you take this idea of glorious out, you can see that we have a land and we have a mountain, and the land is not a mountain. Okay, it's really just really simple logic if you just think about it. A land cannot be a mountain whether it's glorious or not. So when people try and use this idea that the land is the mountain and try and mesh them together, you can see it really is a fallacious argument, and it doesn't really hold water. So let's see what the glorious holy mountain is before we look at what the glorious land is. Let's go to Daniel 9:16. Daniel 9:16, he says, O Lord, to all thy righteousness I beseech thee, let thine anger and thy fury be turned away from thy city Jerusalem, thy holy mountain. So Jerusalem equals the holy mountain. Daniel 9:16. Zechariah 8:1-3. Zechariah 1-3. Zechariah 8:1-3 says, Thus saith the Lord, I am returned unto Zion, and will dwell in the midst of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem shall be called a city of truth, and the mountain of the Lord of hosts, the holy mountain. So we see here that Jerusalem is the holy mountain, and it's also Zion. Isaiah 51:16. Isaiah 51:16 says this, And I have put my words in thy mouth, and I have covered thee in the shadow of my hand, that I may plant the heavens and lay the foundations of the earth, and say unto Zion, Thou art my people. Zion are God's people. So Jerusalem is the holy mountain, is Zion, is people, and it specifically God's people. Isaiah 51:16. 16. Joel 2:1. Joel 2:1. Blow ye a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord cometh, for it is nigh at hand. Zion is God's people, the holy mountain. Note that there's a distinction in this verse between the holy mountain and the land. There's a distinction made. Psalms 48:1-2. Psalms 48:1-2. Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great King. The city of God is Zion, is the mountain of his holiness. Equals the mountain, and I'm going to I won't actually put it there, I'm just going to use this phrase here, where it says it's the mountain of his holiness, or the holy mountain. Isaiah chapter 2 verses 1-3. Isaiah chapter 2 1-3. This is an interesting verse. The word that Isaiah the son of Amos saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall come to pass in the last days, we're living in the last days, that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow into it. And many people shall say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of of the Lord from Jerusalem. We see here that Jerusalem is Zion, is the mountain of the Lord, is the house of the Lord. In the last days, all the nations come to Zion because the law is coming out of Zion. This is the loud cry message. The loud cry message says, come out of her, my people. And this verse clearly tells you that the mountain of the Lord's house, his people, are going to be above the mountains or the nations of this world, and they shall be exalted above those mountains or those hills. This is almost the same imagery that you're given in Daniel chapter 2. And the people say, and many people shall go and say, come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, because out of Zion goes forth the law. And what's the great controversy about at the end of the world? It's to do with the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment, which is part of the law. 1 Timothy 3:15. 1 Timothy 3:15. But if I tarry long, that thou mayest know how thou oughtest to behave thyself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God. So the house of God is the church of God, the pillar and ground of truth. So in summary, the holy mountain is Zion, is Jerusalem, the house of God, and it is the church of God. So in verse 45, when it talks about the glorious holy mountain, it's talking about God's church. And it's talking about God's church when they're glorious, when they're now purified. This is the purified church it's dealing with in verse 45. So what is the glorious land of verse 41? We've looked at what the glorious land is not. It's not a mountain. So let's look at what it is. The king of the north shall stand in the glorious land. Sorry, let me go back. We're back at verse 16. We're back in verse 16. And remember when it says Pompey, when he takes, during that campaign, first he takes down Syria, and then he comes into the glorious land. It says he shall stand in the glorious land. That was the king of the north, Pompey doing that work, conquers Palestine, and he stands in the glorious land. If you look at the history of 63 and onward in the time of Christ, that subjugation of the glorious land was not a subjugation or a taking over of the religion or the church of God in that day and age. All they took over was the land and its judicial running. They let the Jews continue to have basically religious freedom. Okay, so that's the point that we want to get from verse 16. It's this. Sorry? I just paraphrased the verse. Verse 16 said, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, which by his hand shall be consumed. So that history is when pagan Rome stands in the glorious land. That occurred in 63 BC. And when that occurred in 63 BC, it wasn't a subjugation of the church or God's people. It was actually the running of the land. If you look at how Rome operated, by and large, when they took over a territory, they let the people to carry on with their own religions. They didn't try and force their religion onto people. So this conquest or standing in the land in 63 BC is a geopolitical subjugation of the land. It's not a conquering of the church of God or Jerusalem or the people, because that would be a spiritual conquering, and we know that didn't happen because Christ dies on the Passover, and you have Pentecost, you have all the feasts, everything's still in operation long after that. That's in verse 16. We went to Daniel chapter 8 verse 9, remember? When the little horn shall magnify itself against the east, the south, and the pleasant land. Remember that? When you look at that history, it's talking about three territories that pagan Rome took over. It took out Syria, Egypt, and Palestine. It takes down three geographies in Daniel 8:9. When you look at the papacy, when it rose to the power in 538, it too took down three powers, three countries, three geographies. the Hurlei, the Ostrogoths and the Vandals. I gave them in a different order.